I think my perspective on creativity is the renegade notion that everyone is a unique creative genius if they are allowed by themselves and or others around them to discover that and express it. And that's what the journey of life really is about discovering where your passion and your genius falls. I started out many years ago, 30 some odd years ago, as a professional actor in New York. And I was trained in acting and improvisation at both the National Shakespeare Conservatory and then at the National Theatre of Great Britain's acting program. And so I studied with a lot of wonderful people like Ken Campbell and Roddy Maud Roxby, who were very close with Keith Johnstone, and started to really become fascinated with improvisation, spontaneous thought, imagination. And then I went on to become a college professor and taught for many years in universities and conservatories around the country, and developed a lot of programs for even kids as young as preschool and grade school for gifted and talented kids or kids with learning disabilities. And what I found was, whether I was teaching adults in a university, or I was speaking to CEOs of a company, or I was teaching teachers about teaching, I was constantly reteaching adults how to play. I was trying to help adults remember what fun imagination and spontaneous thought was. And I found that a lot of times what would happen when I would go into school systems as an artist in residence and work with kids with disabilities, that I would be approaching these classes where essentially people were saying, you know, these kids have never written 2 paragraphs in their life, you know, if they were, say, seniors in high school in a special ed class. And they would say, they're never going to write a play for you. They're not going to improvise with you. They're not going to even talk to you. And I was fairly cocky, and so went in and just said, you know, that's okay, let me try. And by teaching these kids that were nonverbal, a lot of them, or didn't write, or had real communication problems, real education problems, by teaching them the basics of improvisation and spontaneity and imagination, these kids wound up winning national playwriting contests and screenwriting contests and doing public speaking, kids that had never spoken up in a classroom in their lives, and people thought could not lead a normal life, and certainly not a creative life. And so, making this long story a little bit longer, I eventually combined all my history as a professional director of theater and a teacher and a coach, all into this work in creativity, because I think that essentially my perspective is that everyone's brilliant, and it's not a shortage of brilliant creative genius in the world. It's a problem with delivery. We don't listen to people, and we don't express our ideas. So that's really what has led me to being a creativity specialist, because in my coaching and consulting and speaking and writing, what I do is help people to realize their own creative genius and recognize it in others. We're talking about creativity as being a conscious creator of whatever your talent, thought. It's really the expressing of your imaginative thought, your intuition, your idea. And I really don't separate creativity from life. I mean, people are creative all the time, but I have people tell me, oh, I'm not a creative kind of person, or I'm not imaginative, or gosh, I don't make things. I just, go to work and come home and make dinner. But what they're missing is that 2 things. One, they are creative in everything they do. They are creating whatever that opportunity is that they're participating in. They're creative in the way that they're parenting. They're creative in the way that they're cooking. They're creative, etc. And we problem solve all day. That's creativity as well. We answer questions all day. That's creativity as well. And for me, the big thing that is lacking in all of these, TED Talks on creativity and the massive amounts of books on how to be more creative, is the piece that's missing is recognizing the spontaneous thought. So when I walk into a classroom, say, or a speaking engagement, I will say to a room full of people, raise your hand if you've ever had to stop and think. And everybody in the room raises their hand. And then I tell them, no, you didn't. You have never had to stop and think. We have between 20,000 and 600,000 ideas in a given day. 20,000 maybe actionable thoughts and about 60,000 recognizable thoughts is what the general scientific notion is. So we don't have to stop and think. What we're stopping to do is censor. We're stopping to stop that creative thought and look at it and decide whether it's okay with everybody else, whether it's going to be accepted in the room, whether it's going to amount to anything, whether it's going to be judged. So we're stopping to judge and consider and censor and choose an idea. We're not stopping to have an idea. The distinction that I'm making is between pre-censoring the thought and the magnitude of thoughts and ideas and creative solutions that are not getting out there because people don't express them, or they don't have the mechanism, they don't have the time. I think that everybody, everyone to a person has the potential for creative genius. It's just whether or not they are able to express those ideas and whether or not those ideas are then explored and taken to the next level. Because yes, there is a certain point at which that thought is a useful one or not. But if you're not entertaining 99.999% of your thoughts, then we would never know if one or two or three of them were that brilliant. And because I think we are often held in an environment where the evaluation of the thought and whether it fits into the paradigm of expectation is what happens before the thought is allowed to nurture and grow. If I write a screenplay, if I write a play, if I write a book, I don't have that fully come to me, fully fleshed out and approvable. It goes through rewrites, but it goes through that process because I take it through that process. I respect the ideas enough to explore them, and I shift them and I toss away some. But if I didn't ever start to write, if I didn't ever start into that process, if I didn't have the capacity or the environment to have that encouraged, then those would be lost forever because they would just stay in my mind or fade into oblivion or whatever. So I think, yes, there is a point where a thought has to be in creating something in order to be creative. We're talking about actually being conscious creators, but in order to even start that process, we have to be acknowledging and recognizing the ideas that we have. Essentially, I can help anyone write better, but yes, there are those people for which writing is their gift. There are those people for which cooking is their gift. There are people for which science is their gift. Creativity applies in all of those fields. Creativity and artistic are two different things. Artistic is an area in which creativity gets applied, and they've become synonymous and almost mistaken for one another. But scientists are highly creative. Mathematicians are highly creative. I have 4 daughters, one of which is a mathematician. She's profoundly creative and profoundly imaginative in the world of numbers and shapes. And that is very different than the way that I apply creativity. But it is monumentally valuable. I think that it's the it's the confusion or the sort of amalgamation of the notions of creativity with artistic, or creativity with a certain kind of imagination, that has depleted people's recognition of the fact that I do believe everyone has their unique area of genius. It's just that many of them never get discovered because they are thought to be supposed to be fitting into a particular realm, or they're not valuable. Might be a brilliant creative scientist, or they might just be brilliant at building a deck on their house in a way that nobody else ever thought of. I have a friend who is just amazing at when he needs something, he invents it, he makes it, he builds it, you know, a thing that loads stuff into his truck in a certain way, you know. He's a genius in that regard. Nobody else has that thing but him. Now, also nobody else knows that he does that. You know, people see it and they say, wow, you should market that. That doesn't matter to him. What matters to him is solving his problem, but he is genius at doing that. I think it is part and parcel with what happens in pretty much any area. Either you get used to channeling, if you will, your own creative genius, your own voice, your imagination, or you get real caught up in the system of expressing what somebody else, your interpretation of what someone else thought was creative or right. And in film, in writing, in any area at all, actually, if you are simply imitating that which you've already seen that you were told was the way to do it, or you were told was was good, and you just keep repeating that, that's what creates the mundane, is when it is simply a repetition of answering a question that's already been asked and answered by wherever you got the information in the first place. So a filmmaker, for instance, they might be really, really skilled at setting up shots and keeping that camera moving, and they understand what the language of film is, and they are really gifted at that. But when someone watches their film, all they see is a bunch of stuff that's really cool, but 9,000 directors could have done that same thing because they all went to the same film school. They all understand how to move the camera in that way, but they're not using their own creative genius, their own imagination to touch into what will cause that audience to feel in a certain way. And this is a slightly different subject, but a lot of times what separates in theater, in film, in performance of any kind, even music, what separates the sort of mundane or repetitive or just like everybody else from that unique spark of genius is whether or not the artist involved is committed to expressing what they feel or committed to having the audience feel a certain thing. And that's the experience when you take that audience on an imaginative ride. That's where the real genius of film comes in. I'm kind of veering off into a slightly different subject, but it's really about what separates the mundane from the absolutely beautiful in film or theater is whether or not the focus is on the audience's experience or the focus is on the creator's experience. Maybe a lot of spontaneous ideas, a lot of imagination applied to something, but not all imaginative ideas are particularly valuable in the train that you're following. And so if you're just throwing all your imaginative ideas in there, again, you're more involved in your experience than you are in the audience's experience. And there is a way to bridge those, but the artist has to understand that they are there for the audience. Otherwise, they could just make the film and show it in their living room and have a lovely time day after day. Really imaginative, creative films with very little financial input that has created an avenue where, you know, you have now venues like Netflix and Hulu and a lot of other distribution venues. So really, artists now can be, especially film artists and television artists, can be very, very grateful to the imagination and creativity of those people who created platforms like Hulu and Amazon and Netflix and places that those that can just take your product from creation right out to millions of people worldwide instantaneously. You know, when I first started out in this industry, in the entertainment industry, that wasn't even on anybody's radar as a possibility. And I started a film company many years ago that later actually was responsible, we as a company, we were responsible for creating some technology that brought about real-time rendering. And that started from an idea that I wanted to make a purely interactive television show. I wanted there to be a real-time interactive television show. And this was back before people could really watch a lot of stuff on, this was before Hulu and Netflix. And so I was trying to solve my problem of wanting to be able to have this purely interactive television show, went and found a computer technology instructor at a university who had created a huge supercomputer for very inexpensively, talked to him about, is this possible? He said yes. And in the process of him trying to create my show for me and give me the technological backing for that, he created a real-time render station, which had been unheard of in the film industry before that. Now that's all that company does. It doesn't make movies anymore. It creates this technology to make it possible for someone in their living room to edit a film in real time. Absolutely. With Vimeo, I could put a film up and send the link to whomever I choose, or make the link, you know, so if make the link public. So if my want were to just have people see it rather than monetize it, you know, I can certainly do that. And I think, you know, it's really kind of beautiful that everyone has a voice. At the same time, that creates quite a din. And so we still selectivize into communities that, you know, want to hear a certain kind of thought, you know, just as the community you're building that is all about discussing creativity and how that works. You know, not everyone is going to go seek that out. I wish they would. Again, if we don't explore that, if we don't explore what it means to be creative, as in creating something that wasn't there before, then we just end up repeating the same answers to the same questions, which is part of the difficulty with, you know, I've been a renegade in the education system for a very long time and written curriculums to help bridge the gap for a more creative method of teaching. And part of what I find time and time again in working with teachers is that when I say that, you know, imagine how teaching would change if you walk into every room you walk into, knowing that each person in each seat, each little person there is a unique creative genius. And your job is to provide them the tools to express that genius, not decide whether or not they have any. Know that they have a unique creative genius, and it's about their discovery process, their expression process. That is how we get to acknowledging things that haven't been there before, rather than just repeating the answers to teachers that they already know. Many geniuses along the way, Einstein, Edison, you know, they've all struggled with education not being where they could express their ideas. They are not, there's not something wrong with them that is to be stifled. I think about, you know, the letter that I think it was Edison's mother got a letter, sent home with him that he was unteachable. And what she told her son was, when his mother read the letter, was, your teacher says you're so much smarter than all the other kids. It said the opposite of what the letter said. And I think it's just perspective. If we can nurture that in children, they don't necessarily, or students of any age, because a lot of my students over the years have been adults that have simply been profoundly confined. They don't think they are creative. They don't think, to hear a human being say, I have no imagination, is to me just sad beyond measure, because everyone has an imagination. It's whether or not we've felt allowed to or been able to nurture that and have it be an accepted thing. And so a lot of my work is about kind of breaking down that barrier and getting people to, at least in themselves, honor their own creative thoughts. Because you're right, Einstein and Edison had to go off and do it by themselves. They weren't going to get to do it in the classroom because they couldn't fit into that environment. Now, there might have been other geniuses and profoundly creative, intelligent people in those classrooms that went on to, in those same classrooms, to become leaders in industry or whatever. But for those creative individuals who could not fit the mold while they were experiencing and exploring and learning, if we can find a way to allow for that rather than label it as wrong, it's not wrong, it's a different mechanism that they are exploring through. Yeah. And I wouldn't venture to say that I have the answer as to how we shift the institutional paradigm to allow for those people, but I do think that forums like this allow us to explore the possibility of how we might, as educators, simply be able to allow for those people. I think my classroom looks a lot different than a lot of classrooms, and has perhaps a lot more improvisation in it. But that's because improvisation is a very comfortable environment for me. And I think improvisation is what people are doing all day long, every day in their lives. They just don't recognize it as such. And so one of the things that I try to do with students and with artists and with CEOs and managers is to teach them that everything is an improvisation. And so if you understand the basic concepts of offering, accepting, and blocking, those three basic things, and by playing in improvisation a little bit, get used to what those concepts are, you can understand that where things get thwarted is once an offer is made, by a student, by a colleague, an offer of an idea is made. If it's not accepted on the other side, then it falls into a wasteland, right? If it's not accepted, if it's not at least listened to and received and given its moment in time, it falls into nothing. But also, likewise, if an offer is not made back, it still falls into nothing. It still is like throwing something against a wall of Jell-O. So there's offering, which is the offering of your idea. There's accepting, which is accepting that which is coming to you and making something out of that. And there is blocking, which is the thing that most people do most of their day, which is ways of saying no or cutting off that input that doesn't fit with what you already know. And so I do fall back to teaching people the basics of improvisation in order to give them the ability to gather, bring into their curious realm these different ideas and be able to play with them.